The wind howled through the tall pine trees, sweeping snow in wide, furious spirals across the open land. By the time Eleanor stepped outside to secure the last of the firewood, the horizon had vanished into white. The northern frontier was no stranger to storms, but this one felt different, angrier, heavier, as though the sky itself carried a warning. She tugged her shawl tighter around her shoulders and squinted into the wall of snow. The black hills loomed somewhere behind the whiteness, but they had disappeared hours ago, swallowed whole by the blizzard. A lesser woman might have panicked, but Eleanor had lived through worse. She had buried her husband in the hard ground 2 winters ago, just as the first frost of December took the earth. She had fought off fever, hunger, and even the long ache of loneliness. Storms didn't scare her anymore. Still, something in the air felt unfamiliar. Ominous. With her boots crunching against the icy porch, she finished stacking the last of the split logs beneath the sheltering overhang. Then she slammed the cabin door shut behind her and dropped the latch into place. The inside was warm, blessedly so, with the fire roaring in the hearth and stew simmering over the iron stove. The familiar smells of thyme and rabbit broth wrapped around her like a second cloak. She sat at her small table and peeled off her gloves, fingers stiff and red. Outside, the storm shrieked louder, shaking the shutters like angry fists. She let her mind wander briefly, as it often did during storms, back to the past, to Andrew, with his kind laugh and calloused hands, to the child they'd almost had but never did, to what life might have been if death hadn't come calling so early. Wind wailed again, pulling her back to the present. She stood and moved to the window, brushing the frost from the glass with her sleeve. Beyond it, only a swirling sea of white. It was early afternoon, but the sky was already a curtain of gray, dimming fast. She wouldn't be going outside again tonight, not unless something demanded it. And yet, something nagged at her. A feeling. A flicker of unease she couldn't shake. She pressed a hand to her chest. Where the pendant Andrew gave her still rested a simple silver locket, worn smooth over time. Whenever storms came, she touched it out of habit. Not for protection, exactly, but for grounding. Suddenly, a sharp thud struck the back of the cabin. She froze. It wasn't the usual creak of wind or snow sliding from the roof. It was heavier, more deliberate, like something or someone had stumbled into the rear wall. She held her breath. Then, silence again. Just the howling wind. Grabbing the shotgun from beside the door, she lit a lantern and hesitated only a second before unbolting the back entrance. The cold slammed into her like a freight train, but she pushed forward, holding the lantern high, eyes scanning the white dot. Nothing. Just blowing snow and the outline of the woods. Beyond, she took a few cautious steps toward the back corner of the cabin, boots crunching through drifts that came up to her knees. The lantern flickered, fighting the wind. As she rounded the side, the light caught something. Briefly. Tracks. Small ones. Barefoot. She blinked. That couldn't be right. She bent lower. There they were again, 2 sets of them, no bigger than a child's. The prints led away from her cabin and into the edge of the forest, disappearing quickly in the falling snow. Her heart kicked against her ribs. No settler child would be out here, not barefoot in a storm like this. No sane parent would allow it. Which meant only one thing: they were lost, alone, and likely close to death. She turned back to the cabin. Mind already racing. Blankets, more firewood, hot broth. She didn't know who the children were or how they'd come to be wandering in the storm, but one thing was certain: if she didn't act now, they wouldn't survive the night. Fate had found its way to Eleanor's door. And this storm was far from over. Eleanor didn't hesitate. Within minutes, she had bundled herself in her heaviest coat, wrapped a scarf tightly around her face, and filled a small satchel with 2 wool blankets, a flask of broth, and a pouch of jerky. She tied a rope around her waist and fastened the other end to the cabin's doorframe, a lifeline in case the storm erased her path. The blizzard was a living thing now, furious and unrelenting, but she pushed into it with stubborn resolve. The snow stung her eyes and bit into her cheeks, but she kept the lantern high and her eyes low, searching for those small, barefoot tracks. They were fading fast. Already, the wind was doing its work, erasing the evidence as if the children had never passed this way. She found the prints again just past the tree line, sheltered slightly beneath the thick branches of the pine woods. The tracks were clumsy, uneven. One child, maybe the younger, had started to drag their feet. Eleanor's breath caught. They were slowing down. That meant exhaustion, hypothermia. The cruel fingers of winter were closing in. She called out into the storm, her voice nearly swallowed. By the wind. "Hello, can you hear me?" Nothing. Just the sound of branches groaning under snow and the endless roar of the blizzard. Still she pushed forward. 10 feet, then 20. The lantern flickered but held strong. She moved with more urgency now, following the faint trail as it veered deeper into the woods. Then she saw it. A collapsed log, half buried in snow. And beside it, a lump of small, unmoving shape. Then another. Her heart leapt into her throat. She ran. 2 boys. One curled tightly around the other, their skin pale and lips bluish. They wore thin deerskin tunics, soaked and frozen stiff. The older one, maybe 10, had his arms around the younger, shielding him with what little warmth he had left. Eleanor dropped to her knees beside them. "I'm here," she said, though they might not understand her words. "You're going to be all right." The older boy stirred, barely. His eyes fluttered open, black as onyx, wide with exhaustion and fear. When he saw her, he tried to move between Eleanor and the younger child as if to protect him, but his limbs wouldn't cooperate. The effort drained what little strength he had left. No, it's all right," Eleanor whispered, gently lifting the younger one first. He was feather-light in her arms, his small chest rising shallowly. Still breathing, but not for long. If she didn't move fast, she wrapped him in one of the blankets and slung the other around the older boy, then hoisted the smaller child against her chest and reached for the other's hand. "We have to go. Can you walk?" He blinked, then nodded. Barely. With her lantern in one hand and the younger child in the other arm. She led the older boy slowly back through the snow, her lifeline rope now their salvation. The boy stumbled more than once, but she kept encouraging him, her voice firm and calm over the shriek of the storm. Step by step, breath by breath. When they finally reached the cabin, Eleanor threw the door open and rushed them inside. The heat hit them like a wave. She dropped the satchel, kicked the door shut with her boot, and got the boys to the hearth. She laid the younger one closest to the fire, stripping off the frozen tunic and wrapping him in thick quilts. Then she did the same for the older boy, checking their fingers, toes, lips. They were cold, too cold, but not beyond saving. She ladled broth into a tin cup and brought it to the older boy's lips. He drank in small sips, coughing, his eyes never leaving his younger brother. "What's his name?" she asked gently. The boy hesitated. Then, in a soft, broken voice, he answered, "Chayton." She nodded. "And yours?" A pause. "Vikasa." Eleanor smiled. "You're safe now, Vikasa, both of you." As she fed the fire, the storm howled outside, unaware that its victims had been spared. She looked down at the boys, their fragile lives flickering back into warmth beside her hearth. She didn't know where they came from or who would be looking for them. Eleanor worked through the night. She kept the fire fed, warmed broth, and changed the boys into dry, woolen clothes she had stored from years ago, remnants of what might have been if she and Andrew had ever raised children. It felt strange, almost sacred, dressing those tiny limbs in the hopes of coaxing life back into them. Jicasa. The older boy remained alert but silent, his dark eyes wary. He sat close to his younger brother, Chayton, never touching anything unless Eleanor handed it to him first. He didn't flinch at the heat or the light, only at her. Every time she drew near, he tensed like a fox unsure if the hand offering food was the same hand that once held a trap. She didn't blame him. By sunrise, the storm had calmed, though the snow had piled high enough to nearly bury the porch. Sunlight filtered through frost-glazed windows, casting long shadows on the wooden walls. Inside, the boys had stopped shivering, which gave Eleanor hope. Chayton was still asleep deeply, but his color had returned. His little chest rose steadily. Beneath the wool blanket, Wics sat beside him, legs crossed, watching Eleanor with guarded silence. She brought him another cup of broth and knelt nearby, keeping a respectful distance. "You stayed awake for him," she said softly. "You protected him." He didn't reply. She set the cup on the floor between them and tried again. "You did good, Jicasa, real good." Still, no response, only the twitch of his fingers, the flicker of thought behind his expression. She stood and turned back to the kitchen, giving him space. In truth, she had no idea what to do next. The boys were clearly Sioux. There was no mistaking the bone-beaded necklaces or the tiny red handprint painted on Chayton's tunic, faded though it was. And that presented a risk, not to her, to them. The town of Red Fern, 10 miles east, had grown more tense in recent months. Stories traveled fast on the prairie. A barn burned in the night. A settler's cattle stolen. A wagon family gone missing. People whispered about rising aggression from the nearby Sioux tribes, though Eleanor, who had lived beside these hills for years, never once had a bad encounter. Fear, she believed, did most of the damage before men even lifted rifles, but these were children, lost, innocent. Surely, no one could twist that into a threat, and yet she could already hear the accusations if the town found out. "You're harboring them. You're choosing sides. You're bringing danger to your doorstep." Eleanor looked back at the boys. Chayton shifted in his sleep, and Jicasa gently placed a hand on his chest to soothe him. Despite his young age, his movements were measured, precise, like someone taught early how to carry responsibility. She didn't know how long they'd been in the storm, but judging by their state, it had been close to fatal. Had they wandered from a winter hunting camp? Were they separated from their family by accident or worse? Eleanor took a deep breath, walked to the corner where she kept her writing supplies, and pulled out a sheet of parchment. She lit a candle, dipped her pen, and began writing a letter addressed to the trader at Fort Riley. If anyone could get word to the Sioux tribes camped near the northern ridges, it would be him. "Found 2 young Sioux boys outside my cabin during the blizzard. One near unconscious. No harm done, just trying to return them safely. If their kin are searching, send them this way. E. Callahan." She folded the letter and slid it into an envelope, weighing her decision. It wasn't just the boy she had to think of, was her land, her cabin, her peace. She had lived in solitude for years, her only contact with the outside world through rare trips to town or letters exchanged with a distant cousin in Missouri. Bringing strangers into her home, native children, no less, was something the town would never forgive. But what was she supposed to do? Leave them in the woods? She looked at Jicasa again. He had taken the cup of broth, was sipping it slowly. Their eyes met. For a moment, something passed between them, not trust. Not yet, but recognition. He knew she had saved them, and she knew. This was no longer just an act of kindness. It was a promise. The snow had settled heavy on the hills, blanketing the land in stillness. But Eleanor knew better. This kind of quiet wasn't peace. It was tension. A deep, aching pause before the world resumed turning. often in ways no one expected. Inside the cabin, warmth wrapped around the wooden walls like a protective quilt. The fire snapped and hissed in the hearth. Chayton slept soundly now, no longer. Shivering, his face calm and color restored. Vikasa had stopped flinching at Eleanor's every movement, though he still didn't speak much. He watched, listened, and stayed near his brother Dot. By the third day, Eleanor began teaching him simple English phrases. Water, blanket, fire, brother. He repeated the words carefully, his voice quiet but clear, always glancing to Chayton afterward as if needing permission to focus on himself. She learned a few words from him to Lakota, terms she'd only ever heard spoken in passing at the trade post or whispered by those too nervous to say them aloud in town. Wichaka meant man, Tukazilla for grandfather. He pointed at the hearth once and said, Peta. Fire Dot, it was a slow building of trust, like stones laid one at a time in a bridge, but outside the walls of her cabin, trouble was already stirring. On the morning of the fourth day, Eleanor saddled her mare Molly and rode into Redfern to post the letter she had written. She wrapped herself tightly, pulled her scarf up to her nose, and kept her head low, hoping to avoid conversation. But that kind of hope was foolish in a town as small and sharp-eyed as Redfern. The general store was quiet when she entered, the warmth inside a welcome change from the bite of the wind. Harold Finch, the wiry shopkeeper with tobacco-stained fingers, looked up from behind the counter. Well, look what the snow blew in, he said. Haven't seen you since before first frost. I don't get down much, Eleanor replied, keeping her voice measured. She slipped the letter onto the counter. Need this delivered to Fort Riley. Harold picked it up, squinted at the writing, then raised a brow. Writing to the trading post now, are ya? She nodded. Needed to ask after something. He sniffed, clearly unsatisfied with the vagueness. You hear about the McAllisters? Eleanor paused. No. Whole family's livestock was taken, every last steer. Happened the same night of the blizzard. Tracks led north toward the foothills. Sheriff says it could have been Lakota boys running raids. Said they're getting bolder. Eleanor kept her face unreadable. Storm makes folks do desperate things. Harold leaned in. You do well to watch yourself up in those hills. No telling who's out there these days. She took her change, tipped her hat, and left without another word. Back at the cabin, her heart thudded with unease. The world was tilting beneath her feet. She didn't believe for a second that Vikasa or Chayton had anything to do with the missing cattle. But she also knew how little proof mattered when fear took root in a town like Redfern. That night, as she chopped wood behind the cabin, Vikasa stepped outside, bundled in a too-large coat. He held something in his hand carefully, like it was precious. It was a small charm. Beads strung on leather, feathers at the end. He offered it silently. Eleanor took it in her palm. What is it? He pointed to the horizon. Brother, he said. Then after a pause, he come. Your older brother? She asked. Wicasa nodded slowly. Tasunka. She studied his face. There was no fear in his eyes. Only certainty. He wasn't hoping his brother would come. He was waiting for him. Eleanor looked out into the forest, past the pale ridge lines and quiet trees. Somewhere out there, someone was already riding through snow, through danger, maybe even through fire to find these boys, and when he arrived, she didn't know what would happen, but she had a feeling the real storm hadn't even begun yet. The wind had quieted, but the trail was still cruel. Tasunka leaned forward in his saddle, eyes narrowed beneath the fur-lined hood. His pony, a sturdy black Mustang named Crowfire, picked carefully through the deep snow. Every step was a fight, against exhaustion, but neither of them faltered. Not after 5 days of riding. Not after leaving the winter camp against the advice of the elders. Not when blood still sang in his ears from the moment he'd found the tiny footprints. Disappearing into the blizzard. His brothers were out there, and they were still alive. He believed that with every beat of his heart. Tsunka wasn't the tribe's strongest warrior, but he was the one who never turned back. At 16, he had hunted alone through 3 winters, crossed frozen rivers, and once survived 4 days with nothing but a knife and half a pouch of dried meat. His name meant horse, but it was not given for speed. It was for endurance, for the quiet strength that stayed long after others had fallen. That strength had become a fire the moment Vikasa and Chaitin vanished. It had begun with a runaway pony, a foolish thing. Chaitin had gone after it, Vikasa chasing after him. The time the adults realized, the storm was already rolling down from the hills, fast and merciless. Search parties tried, but the snow blinded even the best trackers. Tsunka had waited only 1 day before setting out alone. Now, 5 days later, his limbs burned with fatigue, and his mind buzzed from too little food. But his eyes never stopped, scanning the land, watching for signs in the trees, shadows in the snow. He'd passed through the remains of broken tree branches, found threads of cloth caught on a thorn bush. Signs that 2 small boys had come this way, but each new sign filled him with dread as much as hope. They were alive maybe, but for how long? Then, as the sun began to sink on the 6th day, he spotted something that made him pull Crowfire to a stop. Smoke. A thin column rising against the golden sky. A cabin. It was nestled at the edge of the forest, simple and weathered. The land around it was still, untouched by the chaos of the storm that had passed. There was no movement, no voices, but smoke meant warmth. And warmth meant life. He dismounted, tied Crowfire loosely to a fence post, and approached the cabin. Slowly, knife sheathed but within reach. He didn't know what kind of settler lived here. Many on the frontier still thought of his people as threats. Most wouldn't open their doors to Sioux children, much less shelter them. Still, he stepped forward, boots crunching softly in the snow. He circled the cabin, moving like a shadow, silent and alert. Then he froze. Through the frosted glass, he saw them. Vikasa, sitting near a fire, his small shoulders wrapped in a thick wool coat. And there lying beside him, under layers of quilts, was Chaitin, pale but breathing. They were alive. Tsunka felt the breath leave his lungs. He didn't knock, didn't call out. Instead, he stepped back into the shadows of the trees and watched. A few minutes later, the cabin door opened. A woman stepped out. She was tall, wrapped in a deerskin coat, hair pulled back in a no-nonsense braid. She looked strong, capable. She glanced around the snowy yard, one hand on her hip, on instinct maybe. Then she paused, her eyes scanning the trees. They met his. For a long moment, neither moved. She didn't reach for a weapon, didn't call out in alarm. She only stared steady and calm. Tsunka stepped forward, slowly, into the clearing. Gaze flicked down to the knife on his belt, then back to his face. She didn't speak. He walked closer, boots crunching until he stood a few feet away. Then he said the only thing that mattered, "My brothers." The woman nodded once. They're inside, safe. He let out a breath, heavy with relief. His posture softened. His eyes, dark and sharp, shimmered with emotion he wouldn't show. She gestured toward the door. "Come in." Tsunka hesitated just for a second. Then, with the wind at his back and the cold loosening its grip on his bones, he stepped through the door into warmth, into safety, and into the arms of the family he thought he might never see again. Eleanor stepped aside as the young warrior entered her cabin. He moved with quiet strength, measured, alert, respectful. Snow clung to his fur-lined cloak, and his boots left wet prints on the floor, but he paid no mind. His eyes, dark and searching, scanned the room once. Then they landed on the two boys near the hearth. Vikasa was already on his feet, wide-eyed, lips parting in disbelief. Tasunka! The word barely left his mouth before he rushed forward. Tasunka dropped to one knee, arms open, and caught his brother in a tight embrace. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just fierce and full of things unsaid. Vikasa buried his face into his brother's shoulder, the rigid strength he'd carried for days melting in a heartbeat. Eleanor turned her gaze toward the fire. Giving them a moment, Chaitan stirred under the blankets. Tasunka gently let go of Vikasa and moved to kneel beside his youngest brother. He placed a hand on Chaitan's chest, feeling the steady rhythm beneath. He brushed a damp strand of hair from the boy's forehead and murmured something soft in Lakota. Chaitan blinked. Slowly, eyes fluttering open, a weak, sleepy smile broke across his lips. Tasunka? The warrior didn't answer. He only placed a hand over his heart, then lightly on Chaitan's. The message was clear. I came for you. I always will. Eleanor, standing near the table, felt a tightness in her throat she hadn't expected. She wasn't a stranger to grief or love, but watching those boys reunited with the one person in the world who would cross snow and danger to find them, that was something deeper, something sacred. She cleared her throat softly. You can stay the night. It's warm here, and I've stew on the stove. Tasunka looked at her for the first time since entering. He studied her like a scout might study foreign land quietly, assessing not out of fear, but out of caution. Then he nodded once. Thank you. His English was rough, accented, but clear. She nodded back and moved to ladle stew into bowls. Vikasa sat with Chaitan, speaking to him in low tones. Tasunka remained on the floor beside them, unmoving except to check the younger boy's temperature with the back of his hand or tuck a blanket higher. When Eleanor handed Tasunka a bowl, he accepted it with both hands and gave a small nod of gratitude, not just for the food, but for something more. She could see it in his eyes. Trust didn't come easy to him. She hadn't earned it fully yet, but she wasn't seen as a threat. They ate quietly. No one filled the silence with idle talk. It was the kind of meal that didn't need words, just the sound of spoons scraping against bowls, the crackle of firewood, and the slow return of warmth into cold. Tired bodies. Later that evening, as dusk pressed in and the world turned silver. Outside the frost-laced windows, Eleanor sat in her rocker beside the fire, mending a tear in Vikasa's coat. Tasunka sat cross-legged on the floor near the hearth, sharpening a blade on a small whetstone. Though his eyes drifted now and then toward the boys as they slept. He finally broke the silence. You saved them. Eleanor looked up. I found them just in time. They were almost gone. She nodded. I know. There was a pause. Then, with effort, he said, You are not like others. She set the coat aside. No, I suppose I'm not. He gave a faint, knowing smile, rare crack in his otherwise stoic expression. My people will remember this. Eleanor didn't reply right away. She looked at the boys, now breathing in unison beneath heavy quilts. I didn't do it to be remembered, she said finally. I did it because no child should die in the snow. Tasunka bowed his head slightly in respect. It was the only answer he needed. That night, he slept in the corner of the room, near the door, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. Not because he didn't trust Eleanor, but because that was what protectors did. She understood. And though they came from different worlds, that small cabin frozen in the deep hush of winter held something rare between them. Not peace, but something stronger. Mutual respect, built not with words, but with silence, courage, and firelight. The dawn came gently, casting amber light across the snow-covered hills. Inside Eleanor's cabin, the world stirred slowly. The blizzard was a fading memory now, but its impact lingered in every quiet moment between those walls. Tasunka rose. Before the others, stepping outside into the crisp air. He stood on the porch, arms crossed, face turned toward the eastern horizon. The land stretched out in silence pure, white, untouched. A hawk circled above, its cry sharp and distant. Eleanor watched him through the window as she stirred the morning porridge. He was still as stone, but not cold, not hardened, just present, like the land itself resilient and patient. By mid-morning, the cabin had warmed again. The boys, now full of life and laughter, sat by the fire playing a game with carved stones. Tasunka had pulled from his pouch. Vikasa taught Chaitan how to line them up and knock them down with flicks of the finger. Their joy was quiet but pure. Eleanor sat at the table, sipping tea as she stitched a patch onto one of the boys' worn tunics. Tasunka approached and stood nearby, watching her work. "You make strong thread," he said. She looked up, a small smile tugging at her mouth. "Stronger than most things I've had to hold together." He nodded, then offered a small bundle of beaded leather from his coat pocket. "For you." She set her sewing aside and opened it gently. Inside was a delicate necklace, strung with sky-blue beads, porcupine quills, and a single carved bone in the shape of a feather. "It's beautiful," she said, genuinely taken aback. "Made by our grandmother," Tasunka said. She wore it when she crossed into the Black Hills for the first time. "It is a thing of honor." Eleanor looked up slowly, brows drawn. "You're giving me your grandmother's necklace?" He nodded. "You gave my brothers warmth and life. In winter, that is more than gold." She ran her thumb across the smooth beads. The gesture touched something deep inside her, something that had been quiet for a long time. Andrew had once gifted her a silver locket. Now, years later, this warrior was offering her something just as meaningful, for reasons just as rooted in love. "I'm honored," she said softly. "Thank you." Tasunka's gaze met hers, and something passed between them again, neither romantic nor fleeting, but profound. A recognition, a mutual understanding of loss, of survival, of doing what must be done when the world offers no easy answers. Later that day, Eleanor took them to the small shed behind the cabin. Inside, old tools and coats hung from rusted nails. She rummaged until she found a pair of children's boots. Still sturdy, though scuffed. "They're a bit big," she said, kneeling to fit them on Chaitan, "but better than nothing." Chaitan beamed and whispered, "Thank you." Vikasa gave a quiet nod of approval, his eyes bright with something close to happiness. When the sun began to dip behind the trees, they lit the fire one last time together. Eleanor set out bread, cheese, and dried meat. Tasunka sat beside her, the boys curled up nearby. They didn't speak much, but they didn't need to. The fire did the talking, crackling, warming, binding them together. Before bed, Eleanor passed Tasunka a map she had drawn herself. It showed the trail north, marked with safe passages through the hills and where game could be found. He studied it silently, impressed by the detail. "You know this land well," she shrugged. "I've had time to walk it." He folded it with care and tucked it into his satchel. "It will help us." "I hope so." Then, at the fire's edge, they sat in silence, eyes on the flames. Different worlds had touched here, and the snow not clashing, not colliding, but warming each other just enough to endure. Eleanor knew they would leave soon. She also knew a part of them would stay, etched in the cabin's floorboards and burned into the air like smoke. A fire had been lit between them, and even when the flames faded, the warmth would remain. The Tinzu. Morning they left, the sky was blue and clean, as if the storm had never existed. Snow still blanketed the hills, but it had softened under the sun's quiet touch. A light wind stirred the trees, sending soft powder drifting from the branches. Like feathers falling, Eleanor stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching as Tsunka tightened the final strap on his pony's saddle. Vikasa helped Chaitin onto a small mare Eleanor had offered them for the journey, an old, sure-footed creature named Juneberry who had long since grown used to slow, careful trails. Tsunka had accepted the gift after long hesitation, offering Eleanor a look she'd come to understand. Gratitude too deep for words. He didn't speak it. He didn't have to. Vikasa turned back to the cabin one last time and lifted a hand in farewell. Eleanor smiled softly, nodding in return. Chaitin peeked over his brother's shoulder and waved with a sleepy grin. He still wore the wool coat Eleanor had patched herself. Tsunka mounted last. He looked over the land, then down at Eleanor, holding her gaze. Around his neck hung the silver locket she had passed to him quietly the night before. It had once been Andrew's final gift to her. Now it was hers to give again, this time to someone who would carry it forward with the same reverence. For protection, she'd said. For remembrance, he'd replied. He gave her one final nod, not just of goodbye, but of respect, of understanding that their paths might never cross again. But what had happened between them was real and lasting. Then, with a soft kick, he turned Crowfire toward the trees, and the three riders disappeared slowly into the woods. Eleanor stayed there on the porch for a long while, staring into the forest long after the sound of hooves had faded. She wasn't sad. She wasn't lonely. Not this time. Inside, the cabin was quiet. Just the whisper of wind through the shutters and the scent of pine still hanging in the air. The blankets folded, the bowls cleaned. The beaded necklace Tsunka had given her now hung from the wall beside the hearth. Swaying slightly in the draft, the cabin felt different now, not emptier. Full of a kind of peace that hadn't lived there since Andrew's passing. A kind of fire that still glowed, even without flames. In the days that followed, Eleanor returned to her quiet routine, splitting wood, walking the trail, feeding the animals, but everything felt just a little warmer. When she ventured into Redfern weeks later, she said nothing of the boys, nothing of Tsunka, and no one asked. But stories began to drift through the region. Stories of two Sioux boys found alive after the worst blizzard in years. Of a warrior brother who rode alone through snow and silence to retrieve them. Of an unnamed settler woman who gave them warmth without fear. Some said it was legend. Others swore it was truth. Eleanor never said either way. But sometimes, in the early dawn, she would stand on her porch with a mug of coffee in hand and look toward the North Trail. Just watching. Just remembering. And in those quiet moments, she swore she could still hear it, the soft thud of hooves in the snow, the laughter of children by the fire, the whisper of gratitude, carried on a winter wind. She had not meant to save anyone. She had not meant to change anything, but she had opened her door when others would have locked theirs. And somewhere, deep in the ridges of the Black Hills, a Lakota warrior rode through the land with a silver locket over his heart. Reminder that sometimes the most unlikely bonds are the ones that endure longest.